If the world is broken, how do you fix it? How do you ensure the best outcome for the most amount of people? Do you push those with the best chance of succeeding to the top, or do you try to collectively make everyone better? Do people need to prove their worth in order to survive, and is this a necessary mindset when faced with extinction? Are those in power obligated to protect those without? These are the questions that lie at the heart of Devil Survivor 2. Or at least, I wish I could say they were. If you've played Devil Survivor 2, then you're probably aware that, while these questions are present, the game is at least as focused on showcasing the lives of some of the blandest characters I've ever seen, and has a true ending that handwaves any nuance the story had. If you haven't played Devil Survivor 2 and clicked on this video because, I don't know, you saw my previous analysis or felt some odd curiosity, you may be wondering,
what the hell is this?
It seems like the game I've described is a clusterfuck. It simultaneously asks philosophical and nuanced questions, but has a message that disregards these questions? And yes, the game does all of that, and more. While it's not a game I could easily recommend to people who aren't already a fan of the genre, it does ask some interesting questions, and I think the most standout thing about this game's story is how effective it is at showcasing the weakness of the message it wants to promote. Before we continue, I'll clarify that, although this is a sequel to Devil Survivor 1, it is not connected to that game's story in any way, so you don't need to have played that game to understand this analysis. Although if you haven't already, I would recommend watching my previous video because some concepts I'll bring up here were mentioned in that video, which might make it easier to understand where I'm coming from. So if you're ready to dive into a game about mending a damaged world, let's talk about Shin Megami Tensei Devil Survivor 2. This game's introduction to the conflict isn't as smooth as its predecessor, but it doesn't waste any time getting into the apocalypse. Unlike the first game, which went for a slow burn approach to its story, Devil Survivor 2 jumps right into the heat of things when, in an instant, Japan is in ruins. People are panicking and no one knows what to do. No one, that is, except for the pseudo-military organization known as GIPS. GIPS works from the shadows to keep Japan safe from supernatural threats using demons and magical barriers. They're one of the most important factions in the game, so it's good that they waste no time in introducing them. They don't interact much with the public the way you'd expect the police or SDF to, and they can come across as cold and even a little paranoid. When you're brought to their HQ after helping them with an incident of a demon breaking out, you happen to overhear their leader ordering the arrest of you and your friends, Daichi and Io, for possessing the demon summoning program. This makes it clear that GIPS doesn't want the average person to have the demon summoning program, and if you played Devil Survivor 1, this seems like a pretty reasonable fear, but you and your friends helped GIPS subdue a demon, even if it was that useless dipshit Daichi's fault it was released in the first place. While Makoto Sako, the agent you worked with to fight the demon, values the help you provide, she's clearly the exception towards the GIPS attitude on civilians rather than the rule. After learning that GIPS wants to arrest you, you and your friends make a break for it, and you run into the seemingly comedic relief character Yuzuru Joe Akie. I say seemingly because unlike many other characters in this game, Joe is more important to the story and themes than his introduction would lead you to believe. The first notable thing he does is grab Daichi, run, and when you catch up to him and ask what his deal is, he tells you that a horde of demons is coming, and that since he stopped to explain that, they've caught up and you have to deal with them. I find this introduction to be weak because it doesn't really tell you anything meaningful about Joe other than that he's extremely blasé and acts like a weirdo. If anything, I imagine most players will assume he's a complete dumbass at first because of the mess he creates that you need to clean up. While Joe can be careless at times, characterizing him as a fool who can't be trusted to tie his own shoes is really unfortunate given how intelligent he proves himself to be. He partially justifies the trouble he's caused by helping you get home, but on the way you run into an enemy you had to escape earlier, Dubei. In this apocalypse, while demons are present, they are not the primary cause of your problems. This time around, humanity is threatened by these extraterrestrial entities known as the Septentrions. The Septentrion take after the stars of the Big Dipper and are classified as something fundamentally different from demons. If you're thinking that some of these creatures look similar to the angels of Evangelion, that would be because their designs were done by Mohiro Kito, a manga artist who is responsible for designing some of the angel designs in the Eva reboot. Unlike the demons, most of them aren't capable of speech and aren't inspired by any mythology. For most of the game, their motivation is unclear beyond trying to wipe out humanity, but that isn't to say they're unintelligent. Many of the later ones target very specific locations that are vital for humanity's survival, and are capable of evolving to improve their combat capabilities. Dubei isn't particularly noteworthy beyond being the first, and to be fair, most of them aren't very interesting either. The majority of the Septentrion fill pretty much the same role of a monster that you need to stop. You fight a Septentrion towards the end of each day, and this feels like one of many things Devil Survivor 2 does to address problems with the first game that goes a bit too far in the other direction. In Devil Survivor 1, the primary bosses were the Demons of Bel, which were not very well paced, as I mentioned in my previous video. The decision to have you fight one of the Septentrion at the end of each day seems to be done to improve the pacing of the game, but it kind of backfired. This isn't really a problem with Dubei, but many of the later Septentrions, such as Mirak, appear out of nowhere, and others, such as Fekta and Benetnash, appear on days when there are far more pressing and interesting things to deal with, and the Septentrions can be very distracting in those cases. For now, all I'll say is, despite being the primary bosses of the game, the Septentrions are not the stars of the show, unlike the character who shows up after you kill Dubei, the leader of Gyps, Yamato Hotsuin. Yamato is one of the most important characters in the game, and even before you get an understanding of his grand plan and ideology, you can already tell a lot from his design alone. He has a trench coat decorated with medals and what looks like an iron cross, is extremely tall and looks down on all. His silver hair partially covers one of his eyes, making him look extremely edgy, and he is perpetually grinning. Everything from his design, tone, and position of power tells you that he's an authoritarian leader, cold and calculating, uses his subordinates as pawns, and is extremely powerful. Just to show off how powerful he is, the next day he summons a Cerberus, which is a mid to late game demon, to eradicate the trailer trash that gets in his way. Other traits you might not guess immediately unless you factor in his age is that he was raised from a very young age to be a genius, which has stunted his sympathy and social skills. In the early game, his cold and empathyless personality is effective for staying calm and analyzing the situation without panicking, but it also has a side effect of making him ignorant of why people act the way they do in a crisis, which can lead to him coming to some unfortunate conclusions, which we saw a bit of earlier when he tried to arrest you. His attitude towards you changes after you beat Dubei, though, and instead of trying to capture you, he invites you to stay at the Tokyo branch of Gyps, which, compared to the rest of the world, is probably the safest and most comfortable place you can be, which, unfortunately, isn't exclusively a good thing, at least from a writing perspective. While there's nothing wrong with your high standard of living in the early game, especially since you earned Gyps' favor, later on if you choose to make decisions that antagonize Gyps, it can create some dissonance where they still let you live in their luxurious headquarters even though you got in their way. It's almost uncanny how the game tries to make your apocalyptic life as comfortable as possible outside of combat, since, unlike in other stories of this nature, or, the previous game, concerns like getting enough food, powering your device that uses the demon summoning program, and where you'll sleep at night have all been mostly swept under the rug. It's only really an issue when you're allowed to keep a Gyps base even after opposing them, but you can't do that in a meaningful way until the endgame, so it's not a huge issue for the time being. The next day, the first meaningful event you do is help Makoto stop random civilians who got their hands on the demon summoning program and are abusing it. If you played Devil Survivor 1, this abuse shouldn't be a surprise, but even if you haven't, it's not hard to imagine that if everyone suddenly got access to an app that could summon monsters to serve their interests, at least a few people would abuse that power. It's a little strange that they brought this up early on because it rarely comes up over the course of the game. There are a few mandatory battles where you stop some demon tamers from abusing their power for short-term selfish goals, but for the most part, the humans you fight are working towards a specific cause as opposed to just screwing with people for the sake of it. This isn't a criticism of writing these types of characters, it's just that the misuse of the demon summoning program feels a lot weaker than how it was handled in Devil Survivor 1. In the aftermath of the battle, we see some very important characterization from your party, notably Joe, who so far has been mostly relegated to trying to act as funny and cliché as possible. Daichi notes how he feels like he hasn't done anything meaningful with his life, with the implication that he's afraid he'll die without accomplishing anything. This isn't the first time we've seen Daichi have a shockingly human reaction to your situation, but it is the first time we see Joe start to fill his primary role, at least in the early game, being emotional support for the party. Up until now, most of Joe's antics have been angled towards comedic relief and being very blasé about their current situation, but here we start to see that there might be more to him than his goofy introduction and personality would lead you to believe. Part of what humanizes him here, as we see more of as the game progresses, is that Joe doesn't have a very high opinion of himself, but still manages to function anyway, so he probably knows exactly what they're going through, especially Daichi, who seems to remind Joe of aspects of himself based on their interactions. Joe being a pillar that supports your group was seen a little earlier when he makes sure you don't go through a horde of demons to get home and showing concern for Io's injury, and with the benefit of hindsight, you start to understand that part of the reason he acts the way he does isn't just because he's a weirdo. He's deliberately trying to cope with the situation and lighten the mood so you and your friends don't wallow in self-pity and despair. This fake-it-till-you-make-it mindset is most clearly seen later on the second day when Yamato fills you in on how truly dire the situation is, and how for all they knew, the rest of the world, barring a handful of cities, have been wiped out. This understandably freaks Daichi and Io out, and they can't handle the building up stress which causes them to break down and run away, with even Joe, while not breaking down like Daichi, still needing a bit to collect himself because despite his mannerisms, he's not some invincible wall of optimism. He has his breaking points. When you go to talk with Joe, you get the clearest understanding of how he sees himself and what motivates his decisions. He acts a lot more chill than he actually is when you show up because, well, of course he does. You're just a kid, and given how Daichi and Io reacted, he probably feels, as an adult, that he needs to not drag you down with his own woes since who can you and your friends turn to? Gyps is full of mostly cold and uncaring soldiers who aren't going to care about the panic and fear you're dealing with. Unlike your other conversations with him though, this time he starts to soften up after he sees and admires how calmly you're able to handle the situation without being emotionless. Towards the end of the conversation, he says that,
"Well, no use brooding. With all this crazy, we've got to stay positive. Even if we're faking it. Whatever it takes to cheer up."
This is part of the reason why Joe is my favorite character, in no small part because I understand where he's coming from, and frankly it's admirable how he's able to force a confidence he doesn't really have in order to not worry others. It's pretty telling that he ends the conversation by saying that he'll be back to his old self in a jiffy. It's not as if his personality is all a front, he is genuinely a bit of a weirdo, but there is an empathetic and caring soul in his eccentricity. After beating the demon tamers who were abusing their power, Joe further distracts the party from their troubles by letting them know Yamato wanted to see them, and we see one of the first instances of what I'll call Yamato's attempts to groom you. He tells you that he wanted to bring you to Osaka because he believes you can be useful, and he starts his persuasion by reminding you of how he kept his promise to try and escort you to your homes, and making any other option besides following him seem pointless. He doesn't actually give a compelling reason for why you should go to Osaka, he just says you might find clues for the cause of the disaster, but doesn't explain why Osaka would hold these secrets. In fact, you don't really learn why the apocalypse is happening while you're there. You recruit some party members, kill a Septentrion, and confirm that the only places on Earth that have any life are Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, since those are the only Gyps branches they could make contact with. That latter point is important, as I went into a minute ago when talking about Joe, but it's not only important for how it develops Daichi, Io, and Joe, it's also another step in Yamato's grooming. This information works as a natural extension of his argument back in Tokyo, where he shows you that your options are limited to the point where following him is the most logical decision. We'll see more of this as the game progresses, and since there isn't much to say about your new shitty party members for the time being, let's move on to the next day, which introduces a group that sets up the primary conflict, the Nagoya rioters and their leader. The third day starts simply enough. Daichi had agreed the previous day to help transfer supplies since his one redeeming quality is his possession of a driver's license, one he definitely deserves based on his experience with Dubei. Unfortunately, because he's Daichi, the place he goes to faces disaster and Gyps loses contact with their Nagoya branch, so you're told to gather the crew and figure out what went down. When you get there, the situation is chaotic and Gyps' forces have been overwhelmed, and not by the demons nor the Septentrion, but by other humans. Throughout the day, you recruit more allies and learn that these rioters planned a coordinated attack and have pushed Gyps out of their Nagoya headquarters, and are being led by a man named Ronaldo Kudaki. The image that's painted before you meet him seems to be that he's anti-authoritarian, ruthless, commands the respect of the very diverse population of rioters, which includes everyone from students to office workers to even the Yakuza, and he really hates Gyps. All of this makes it seem like he's going to be a typical chaos-aligned character, only for that expectation to be subverted when you meet him and he reveals why he's attacking Gyps, and talks about a subject most chaos characters would never consider: justice. Ronaldo is actually a law-aligned character, which becomes apparent when he makes it clear his goal is in service of helping the weak, and his rhetoric includes calling you sinners for hoarding supplies while the people outside of Gyps are starving in the streets. To further subvert expectations, when you meet him, he tells all of his men to fall back with the supplies while he fights you off. alone. His goal is not necessarily to beat you, although he certainly does try, but to make sure his comrades can get away with their ill-gotten gains into the hands of their allies and people who need them. Ronaldo's introduction might be even more informative than Yamato's, because while there is a lot you can tell from Yamato when you meet him, he has a lot of secrets that you uncover over the course of the game, whereas Ronaldo is an open book. After knowing him for only a few minutes, you get a pretty good understanding of why he's assaulting Gyps, what his moral framework is, and how he has so many people loyal to him. As if to further demonstrate his integrity, when the mandated Septentrion shows up to be a nuisance, he doesn't use the opportunity to escape but stays to fight at your side, recognizing that if this thing were to escape, everyone would be in danger. After you defeat it, Makoto shows up with reinforcements, and Ronaldo understandably thinks he's screwed given all the trouble he's caused Gyps, but Makoto lets him go. This is not a decision the other members of Gyps approve of, and one Ronaldo wasn't expecting, but it does clue him in that Makoto might be more aligned with his values than he first expects. He also suspects that you and your friends are only working with Gyps to survive, and at this point considers you less of an enemy and more of an uneasy acquaintance, and as the game goes on, a friend. Before he leaves, he warns you not to trust Yamato and to be wary of Gyps. The battles with Ronaldo and the rioters is what makes your party realize they've been getting special treatment this whole time and that most average civilians aren't so well off. This is played as if it's an important reveal, even though it's kind of obvious. It's clear very early on that Yamato doesn't hold civilians in high regard, and it's even more apparent that he values you and your party more than even some of his own men. Ronaldo is meant to act as the primary rival to Yamato, and they contrast in many ways. Ronaldo is very moralistic, wants to protect civilians or anyone else who can't protect themselves, and will staunchly oppose anyone he considers evil. Yamato, on the other hand, is amoral, not to be confused with immoral, and doesn't think civilians or really anyone else is worth his time unless they can prove otherwise by supporting or opposing him. This may make it seem like Ronaldo is clearly the better of the two, but there are some factors that complicate the situation. For one, Gyps makes the claim that they need to keep all the supplies they hoarded so that those who have the best chance of fighting the Septentrion can be in their best condition, and that evenly distributing the supplies the way Ronaldo wants would weaken humanity's chance at survival. Gyps is making a very utilitarian argument, and the angle the writers seem to be going for is that Ronaldo may be a more morally righteous person and his forces are capable of holding back the demons. They're probably not enough to stop the Septentrion. This would be an interesting dilemma where, even though you don't need to make a decision of who you support immediately, you do need to consider if it's better to try to save those who can't contribute to humanity's survival, or if it's necessary to maximize the odds for the people who can keep humanity alive in the long run. Unfortunately, there is a slight problem with this dichotomy, and it's not the one you might expect. The problem this could have very easily run into is making Yamato the more safe choice and Ronaldo the more risky choice. And if they did that, Ronaldo would be the correct choice every time because, since this is a video game, failure doesn't really mean anything since you can always just try again. Luckily, this isn't the problem that's present, although it is a somewhat related issue. While you don't find out until much later, the apocalypse of Devil Survivor 2 doesn't last long enough for the preserving supplies argument to hold any water. If Yamato and Gyps didn't know how long the apocalypse would last, I would say their argument still makes sense, but unfortunately, Yamato knew how long this apocalypse would last, given that he was told it would happen ahead of time, as you learn later if you investigate Yamato's files with Ronaldo. For now, though, Ronaldo retreats, and his primary role in the story going forward is twofold. One is to clue you in on Yamato's secrets, like the fact that he knew the apocalypse was coming, and the other is to oppose Gyps at every opportunity. For the first point, him cluing you into Yamato's secrets runs into the same problem as the 10-bit events from Devil Survivor 1. If you didn't watch my last video or just need a reminder, this is the problem of learning an important secret that serves no purpose since you learn the same information anyway in mandatory events. In this case, you can learn Yamato's secrets, but he's all too happy to share them himself when he considers the time to be right. As far as Ronaldo's opposition to Gyps is concerned, his altruistic motives are what keeps his rioters united in supporting him and is central to his character, but it's technically not the only reason for him opposing Gyps. Ronaldo is a former detective and believes his mentor was killed by the Hotsuins for learning too much. A belief Yamato also has, since you can ask Yamato if he did it and he will very heavily imply he did. It turns out that mentor, Deradeka, is still alive and has a questline, but considering where it goes, he may as well have just been dead. It is interesting that Yamato either thinks he killed Deradeka or wants you to stop asking questions, and while that second answer is consistent with his personality, it's the only time where lying to you doesn't work in his grand effort to groom you into his right-hand man. If anything, it's more likely to make you turn away from Yamato. Honestly, they could have cut Deredeka entirely and nothing of value would have been lost. If anything, Ronaldo and Yamato seem to forget he exists for most of the game, and Ronaldo's ideological motivations for opposing Gyps are far more important to his character, so let's take a note from them and pretend Deredeka's quest never happened. After this day, Ronaldo becomes more important to the plot and themes of the game, but also has less of a presence until the end game, since he's one of the people you can choose to side with for an ending, so they didn't want to make you fight him more than necessary. Before the day ends, though, you have a couple of interactions with Joe as he tries to piece together the plot with what you know so far. He's not able to determine anything concrete, but he does come to some reasonable conclusions based on knowledge available. This is nice because it doesn't come across like he's just reading the script to get the player caught up on things, and it shows an important aspect to Joe, and that's his surprising wisdom. Most of the characters take his personality at face value and assume he's a dumbass. The only people who recognize that there's more to Joe than meets the eyes, other than the player, are Yamato and Makoto, people who are part of a faction which prides itself on being able to recognize talent. For now, all you're able to determine is that the Septentrions are targeting the towers of the 3 cities you've been to, and that the demon summoning program was likely given to humanity to stop a Septentrion. This mystery doesn't last too long, though, because the next day you meet a character who answers most of your questions, the Anguished One. I'll be calling him the Anguished One for the time being, as that's how he introduces himself, but as the game goes on, he gets different names depending on your choices. In his introduction, he flexes harder than Yamato did earlier by snapping a mini Septentrion out of existence, and displays abilities that make it clear he's not human. Despite being introduced on the 4th day, he's one of the most influential characters in the game, and his role in the story depends on how much you interact with him. If you keep your interactions to a minimum, then his role is that of a wise enigma who gives you crucial advice needed to defeat some of the Septentrion, and contextualizes the purpose of the apocalypse. He informs you that the Septentrion are here on behalf of Polaris, a godlike entity who controls reality, and is testing humanity to see if they deserve to continue to exist, given how she sees them as stagnating. It's presented a little vaguely, but it's not hard to imagine why Polaris is upset with humanity, given how often we go to war with each other or destroy the planet via climate change. The Anguished One has a vested interest in humanity since, as you learn if you spend time with him, he's the one who granted humanity fire and language. He's interested in humanity's potential and is the one responsible for distributing the demon summoning program, which has helped you overcome Polaris' trials. This may make it seem like he's working against Polaris, when in reality he's a direct subordinate to her, being the last of the Septentrion. If you've seen Neon Genesis Evangelion, this probably isn't surprising to you, as he takes even more inspiration from Evangelion's Kaoru than Makoto does from Misato, or the other Septentrions from the Angels. Like Kaoru, he has a deep love and interest in the protagonist and takes a human form even though he's in league with the monsters trying to kill humanity. Despite being her subordinate, the Anguished One takes actions Polaris disagrees with at several points in the game, giving you the DSP being one of them. This is never directly stated, but since Polaris is described as trying to test humanity to see if they deserve to reshape the world, it seems like Polaris wanted humanity to have some means of fighting her Septentrions, and they were likely supposed to do it with Gyps' sealed demons and the dragon stream that Yamato controls. The Anguished One mentions that he is the one who gave Yamato the knowledge of the apocalypse as well as the tools needed to overcome Polaris' trials. Unfortunately, to the Anguished One's dismay, Yamato's ideology led him to hoarding supplies for Gyps and not trying to save as many humans as possible. In response, the Anguished One distributed the DSP to as many people as he could so that more people could reliably save themselves, which unfortunately had the consequence of the widespread DSP abuse that we saw earlier. This further diminished Polaris' faith in humanity and made the Anguished One question his actions. He admits later that humanity may be in this situation because of him, and if he didn't give you the means to pursue your potential, you might not have incited Polaris' wrath. This hurts him because he genuinely does love humanity and has never grown bored with them as he's watched their growth over the millennia. Part of his character development that you see in his own route is wondering if he could ever have a place among humans since he is so fundamentally different from them. You can tell that he's not necessarily upset about his immortality and that he's always been interested in the new Shining One, which is the term he gives to people he sees the most potential in, that appears every generation or so, but wishes he could have a more intimate friendship than being a mere observer. Well, to call him an observer is a bit inaccurate seeing how he distributed the demon summoning program against Polaris' wishes, and took certain actions to oppose Yamato. Some of these actions include sending a demon to disable the teleporter, which would have resulted in Yamato's death, and he's responsible for brainwashing a Gyps hacker named Fumi earlier in the game, which allowed the rioters to overrun Gyps. He does this because he thinks if Yamato gets his way, human potential may be stifled, so he wants to remove Yamato from the picture. Unless you decide to side with the Anguish One on the ending split, he reveals himself to be the last of the Septentrions on the last day and acts as the second to last boss before Polaris, and although you must kill him, he accepts that fate as part of his duty as a Septentrion and believes the path you chose will be okay, since he put his faith in you as a Shining One. If you side with him, he develops more as a character, but I'll get into him more when talking about the endings. For now, let's return to some of the important players in this conflict. On the fourth day, two of the most noteworthy things that can happen are Joe's near-death experience and Ronaldo's interactions with Joe and Makoto. For the first point, you lose contact with Joe pretty early in the day, and if you don't try to find him, he will be killed trying to protect civilians from demons. While this in and of itself isn't particularly noteworthy, there are two circumstances behind it that are very important. One is how, since he has the potential to die, he becomes a less relevant part of your team because if he was as important as he was on days prior, they'd have to write a version of the story where he influences the plot and another where he's dead and whatever he does can't happen. This isn't to say he no longer contributes to the plot, but his role becomes downsized and he ends up being influential to the other circumstance in the battle where he can die, Ronaldo's inclusion. In this battle, Ronaldo also received the death video, the gimmick that tells you when someone important to you is at risk of dying, and came to save Joe as well. This event is the start of Ronaldo and Joe's friendship, and both learn something very important about the other. For Ronaldo, this is the first time he's seen anyone in your party so thoroughly risk their lives to save people, because Joe did not have his demons at the time since his phone was dead. While I'm sure the other members of your party would do the same, this is the first time he's seen one of you take the leap from saying you'll do it to actually doing it. Joe, on the other hand, learned something far more important to him, that Ronaldo and his rioters are the ones who are protecting the defenseless civilians from demons, the type of people that Gyps won't protect. While it takes some time for Ronaldo to warm up to Joe, Joe spends more time hanging out with Ronaldo and the rioters, shifting his emotional support from your party to Ronaldo. It's not as if Joe stops caring about your party, but that he spends more time with Ronaldo, who pushes himself a bit too hard for his own good. There's a scene later on where Joe feeds Ronaldo some alcoholic chocolate, and after Ronaldo passes out because he's a lightweight, Joe carries him to bed. This is played as a comedic relief scene, but like with many of Joe's scenes, there's some subtext to the situation. Joe is pretending to steal some of their stolen supplies when in reality he never took anything, and while forcing Ronaldo to rest in the way he does is, questionable, Ronaldo probably did need to get some rest given how hard he pushes himself on the raids against Gyps and fighting the demons in Septentrion. Later on, Joe's support shifts from being comedically slanted to being genuinely worried. After the rioters take enough beatings, Ronaldo is determined to fight Gyps alone on what's practically a suicide mission when Joe intercepts him and tries to get him to calm down, appealing to Ronaldo's morality over his desire for revenge against Gyps. When Joe tells him,
You don't look like a man who wants to help people anymore. This isn't about justice. It's about you.
Shut up. Don't lecture me.
it clearly affects Ronaldo, but it's not enough to stop him. Ronaldo is determined to go all out against Gyps, which he was avoiding for a time due to his complicated relationship with Makoto. Makoto is someone who Ronaldo believes is a good person and is therefore someone he'd like to avoid fighting. He spends several events after Makoto lets him go trying to convince her that Gyps is evil. In one noteworthy event, he asks her to justify Gyps' actions, and she gives the explanation that Gyps needs its supplies to beat the Septentrion, and by extension keep humanity alive, which Ronaldo concedes makes sense. But then he says this.
Could you say those words to a starving innocent? To a mother carrying the body of her child? It's sad, Makoto. The empty logic of those in power. They talk up the nobility of sacrifice because they never have to do it.
Now, to be fair, this isn't the full picture since in this particular case, those in power are on the front lines fighting the Septentrion, but it is also true that they're not the only ones suffering the wrath of the Septentrion. The core of what Ronaldo is saying here and what defines the rivalry between him and Makoto is that the ones in power are the ones making the decisions of who qualifies as worthy and unworthy, and that this is unjust. Ronaldo is clearly more qualified than most Gyps agents to fight the Septentrion, and while Gyps will accept civilians like you who can prove themselves useful, they aren't casting a wide net to recruit as many people as possible. This is because Yamato, and by extension Gyps, has a mentality that civilians are useless until proven otherwise, and to understand why, we need to look at the ideology that underpins Yamato's actions. At the end of the 5th day after you beat Alioth, Yamato holds a feast to commemorate your hard work and announces his plans for fixing the world, and his efforts to groom you into his right-hand man come to a head. You learn that by beating the Septentrion and meeting Polaris, the one who meets her will have the power to reshape the world as they see fit, and Yamato declares that he will turn the world into a meritocracy. Meritocracy is a system where your station in life is determined by your capabilities. It has similarities to, although it is not the same as, social Darwinism, the idea that life itself is a competition and that whoever is most capable will end up on top. This ideology is why Yamato doesn't think civilians are worth his time, and why he doesn't want to share supplies to anyone who can't prove their worth. The reason he hasn't been giving supplies to civilians isn't because it's the utilitarian thing to do, as he's implied, but because in his ideal world, people won't be given anything if they can't prove themselves. Given his upbringing and separation from society, it's not very surprising that he comes to believe in meritocracy. As we learn when talking with Yamato, he was raised on college-level courses when he was very young and was himself groomed to be the leader of GIPs. Most of what he sees throughout the game confirms what he's always thought of society, that it is fundamentally flawed and allows the incompetent to thrive while talent wallows away in mediocrity, with his greatest example being you. You grew up a completely normal life, and yet you've proven yourself to be one of the most capable demon tamers in the world, and he believes it is unacceptable that someone talented like you is forced to be on the same level as the ignorant masses. He believes that the primary reason society is degenerated is because of excess compassion, which is similar to the beliefs of Ayn Rand in that respect, where he thinks people of talent and intellect should be allowed to do whatever they want unimpeded, and that caring for the poor or unfortunate is a waste of resources that could be going to the greats of society. While this ideology is very cold-hearted, an interesting thing I'd like to note is that it doesn't, as a rule, promote violence. I feel this is an important note to make since one of the endgame factions criticizes this ideology for its willingness to resort to violence to achieve its ends, as opposed to anything else about it. If anything, Yamato and the other meritocrats find violence as a solution to be acceptable but not ideal. Yamato explicitly thinks many civilians are worthless because they waste time fighting amongst themselves instead of working towards the survival of humanity. One of the best examples of how violence isn't the purpose of this ideology is how Yamato handles failure. You might expect from such an authoritarian figure that he'd punish failure harshly, when in reality he almost never resorts to punishing his subordinates beyond calling them useless. As he tells you,
"Punishment is for those who fail to meet expectations. I will not waste time punishing those from whom I expect nothing."
While this, along with the rest of his ideology, is pretty mean-spirited, I think that's an important distinction from being violent. His ideology leaves the weak to die out, which is still bad, but it's not the same thing as hunting them for sport. This distinction will be important later for understanding the final piece of the conflict, but before we move on to that, we need to discuss the main ideological foil to Yamato's meritocracy, egalitarianism. Upon learning of Yamato's master plan and how Polaris can reshape the world, Ronaldo uses this as an opportunity to unite a stronger front against Yamato, this time under the banner of equality. Compared to meritocracy, there really isn't much to explain, and it wasn't a part of a grand plan for Ronaldo, but was more of a reaction to Yamato's plan. What Ronaldo and the egalitarians want is a world where no one is better than anyone else, and everyone helps each other out when they're in need. This ideology isn't only a rebuttal to meritocracy, but this is a natural extension of the way Ronaldo and the rioters have operated throughout the game. Stealing supplies to give to those who can't join the fight and protecting the weak from demons has always been Ronaldo's justice, but knowing of a way he can fix the world in a literal sense given the encroachment of the void that is consuming the world, and the ability to implement compassion on a global scale spurs him to more direct action. Unfortunately, this call to action results in a confrontation with Makoto, which can result in her death without your intervention on the 6th day. As I hope I've made it clear so far, these two characters are foils to one another and even have events that mirror each other where they save members of the opposing faction from being wiped out by demons. Ronaldo's event specifically notes how he's grown as a person, becoming determined to be a shield to protect the weak rather than a sword to be wielded against evil. Realizing if he walks too deeply down the path of blood, he may become that which he swore to destroy. He also recognizes that his enemy is Yamato and not every individual GIPS agent. This would be fine, except you can get these events before the event where Ronaldo tries to kill Makoto, which can lead to some severe narrative whiplash. If the conclusion to his character arc where he lessens his hatred of GIPS happened after he attempted to kill Makoto, there wouldn't be a problem since the event before he saves the GIPS agents from demons was the one I showed earlier, where he's acting a lot more bloodthirsty and determined to kill as many GIPS agents as possible. Unfortunately, since you can get that event before he tries to kill Makoto, it makes him look like a hypocrite. You can't just go from declaring that you won't kill everyone who stands between you and Yamato, and then kill someone who you've already beaten, and think is a misguided good person just because she was helpful to Yamato. There are a couple of reasons I can think of for why this happened this way, and none of them are really excuses. One is that they wrote the scene of him saving the Gyps agents after the scene where he tries to kill Makoto, and they forgot to code how early you could get these events. The other is that they wrote the scene of him saving the Gyps agents before killing Makoto, but realized that up until this point, Ronaldo hasn't really been morally ambiguous enough, so they needed him to do something that would make him look like less of an obviously better choice than Yamato. I'm more inclined to believe the latter in this case because if Keita, one of the characters you met on day 2, dies, then Makoto won't die here, so it probably would have been easy to put a check to see if Ronaldo's fate rank, which is the number showing the progress of their character development, is at a point where he wouldn't be inclined to kill Makoto. If you haven't played the game, this might sound a bit conspiratorial, and you might think it's weird that the writers would resort to this pseudo-character assassination to make Ronaldo look bad, and that's because I've deliberately avoided talking about the third and final faction of this game that doesn't have an official ideology, so I'll just call them... Before I explain who the neutrals are and how they frame themselves, I think it will be useful to explain what the neutrality bias is. This is the belief that when there is a conflict between groups, the answer to the question that's caused them to come into conflict lies in compromising. This idea is important to understanding the neutrals because without it, the neutrals' actions come across as, to put it lightly, bizarre. They seem to start simple enough with Daichi and Io saying that they think Ronaldo and Yamato are too extreme. Okay, that's already not a great start since it's drawing on a false equivalency, and more to the point, it doesn't even make sense to say given that they give very clear and articulate criticisms of meritocracy, but the most they can say against egalitarianism is that friends shouldn't fight? This is a weird stance to take because 1, the explicit goal of the egalitarians is eternal peace, and 2, the neutrals are more than willing to resort to force to prevent their friends from fighting. If they were dead set on being pacifists, this wouldn't be a problem, except in every route they fight the other factions to force them to stop fighting, which wouldn't be an inherently bad thing if it weren't for the fact that the reason the egalitarians are fighting is to make a world where people are more compassionate and won't fight anymore. Okay, so besides a false sense of pacifism and equating both meritocracy and egalitarianism as too extreme, what else do they have? Well, if you don't side with them, they don't really have anything. They don't have a plan for how they can fix the world through Polaris because they seem like they don't even have an ideology. As I mentioned earlier when talking about meritocracy as cruel versus violent, they seem to have a problem with meritocracy on the grounds that cruelty and violence are the same thing, which I might not inherently disagree with, but they use this logic to say that Ronaldo is cruel because Ronaldo is willing to use violence, while completely ignoring the fact that he's using violence as a means to make the world more peaceful. And if it's wrong to fight your friends to create a world without fighting, why is it okay for the neutrals to resort to force? And before any of you who've played the game try to say that, oh, they only use violence in self-defense, let me remind you that that is only the case in their own route. In every other route, you go to them looking to make peace, and instead of saying no or go away, they fight you. In fact, they don't just fight you, they summon gods in an attempt to kick your ass. Their sense of false pacifism is already pretty bad, but it would be unfair of me to say they only criticize the egalitarians on the grounds of pacifism, because their representative, Daichi, says this.
I'm not really feeling the merit system or the whole forced equality thing. Forced equality thing. Forced equality thing. Forced equality thing.
If they're going to stretch that far to explain why they're against the egalitarians, I'm shocked they didn't just call Ronaldo a dirty communist, given that the term forced equality sounds like something a McCarthyist would say at the height of the Cold War, or what a racist would say about desegregation. Sometimes the neutrals bend over backwards so far that they outright lie just to have reasons to oppose the egalitarians. Hinako, one of the more vocal neutrals who was introduced on the second day, tells an egalitarian,
"It wouldn't be good at all."
Wouldn't everyone be happy? I'd help you, you'd do the same for me. Wouldn't that make the world a kinder place?
But it couldn't happen. You know I'd risk my life for you, but not for random strangers.
This is literally untrue because her introduction is risking her life to save people she's never met, and she spends most of the game being very gung-ho about saving people whenever she can, but now she'd only save her friends because what? If she thinks more people should help out, then she'd be agreeing with Ronaldo? Now I know this is an SMT game, and most SMT games tend to favor a centrist way of thinking, which I touched on a bit in my video on the previous game. But Devil Survivor 2 is an especially egregious example. While most SMT games rely on rhetoric and music to convey which ending they want to frame as the best, Devil Survivor 2 goes far and beyond by framing the neutral ending as not only the best ending, but also the canon one. If you think I'm exaggerating, they give achievement points for every ending, and the true neutral one gives 200 points of New Game Plus perks, while every other ending gives only 30. I'm not going to be showing footage of the triumphant ending, partially because I didn't recruit enough people, but mainly because I have nothing more to say about it, since from a writing perspective, it's literally no different from the normal neutral ending. But since the game considers it the best ending, I'm going to save it for later and talk about the other, better endings first. I'm going to start with Ronaldo's ending because it's one of the easiest to talk about, and as you may have guessed based on my tone when talking about Ronaldo, it's my favorite ending. As I alluded to earlier, the world the egalitarians create is one where human nature is made to be more compassionate, so people are more inclined to be selfless and help others in need. The ending describes this world as a literal paradise, the kind humanity has dreamed of for ages, although I think we should take this with a grain of salt, seeing how the ending also makes some, dubious claims. Something that's important to understand about this ending is, despite what characters like Hinako want you to believe, it's not about making everyone the same, and isn't even about brainwashing, unless you consider human nature to be literally perfect and any alteration to it to be evil. If this ending was about making some cliché young adult dystopia, no one would actually be advocating for it. When you get to Polaris and ask her to make the world a better place, she asks you why you couldn't do that without her help, and Ronaldo tells her that humans are inherently weak, but with the right help, they can improve. When Polaris sees you wish to use her power to make humanity naturally more considerate and not just control them, she grants your wish and tells you that this is a version of humanity that she wanted to see. Now, I'm not going to say the world being created here is without flaw, as there would be a cost to making this extremely selfless and cooperative world. The ending tries to acknowledge this by asking, if humans lack a competitive drive to excel, can they maintain this prosperity? Well, the answer to that stupid question is yes. If you're wondering why I think that's a stupid question, it's because there is very little reason to believe a world where people are more compassionate would be less inclined to improve the quality of life for humanity. In this world, people won't need to worry about needing money for hospitals or food or a roof over their heads because everyone will have access to them. Same goes for education. The game implies that without competition, innovation won't occur, but this is just false. It's a myth that hardcore individualists like to promote that competition creates innovation, and this is obviously true to an extent, but there's something being implied yet omitted. The implication is that innovation only occurs with competition, even though incredibly important inventions such as the polio vaccine came through cooperation, not competition. Obviously, games and other works of art are made in competition with one another, and competition can definitely create innovation, but the point is competition isn't the only way to innovate. In reality, a world where no one is better than anyone, no potential geniuses who may have otherwise died in wars, poverty, or starvation will have equal access to education, logic would dictate that this humanity is more likely to progress rather than stagnate. It is true that without a competitive spirit, sports and other competitions will die out as anything more than simple entertainment rather than something people train to get better at, and most, if not all, markets would likely collapse, which, if not for the fact that Polaris made everyone more considerate and kind, the market doesn't really need to exist. Neither does money. People don't need money to buy or sell things. People will just create out of passion or understanding that certain resources, like food, must be created. Ultimately, my biggest criticisms of this ending are that it's boring and the way Yamato dies is kind of stupid. For all intents and purposes, the ending is pretty boring and is the most milquetoast version of an ideal world that even a child could conceive of. It's a generic good guys win and fix all the world's problems with magic ending, which is lame, and the only interesting aspect of it is how the game frames this ending as bad. In that sense, it's interesting as a way of viewing the other ending's shortcomings and how willing the game is to acknowledge said shortcomings. Addressing the point of Yamato's death, which is really minor, but I feel like I need to mention it anyway. Yamato dies in this route, which is to be expected given that Ronaldo dies in Yamato's route, but the way Yamato dies here is idiotic. Mechanically, it's the exact same fight in the neutral route, except in the neutral route after you beat Yamato, you can recruit him because it's not like you killed him. In Ronaldo's route, you make the same proposition which Yamato denies, and because Yamato
There's too much of the Dragon Stream's power!
The tower you were fighting near collapses, and in a heroic sacrifice, he blows you back to save you. Now, if this and Yamato's routes were the only routes in the game, this wouldn't be a huge issue. The problem is, while Yamato and Ronaldo's deaths are compatible with each other's routes, they're not compatible with the Anguished One in neutral routes. Yamato saving you is incompatible with the Anguished One's route because in that route, even after being beaten, he tries to kill you in a last-ditch effort to kill everyone in your party, even if it means he goes down with you. So the idea that he wants to make sure someone can get to Polaris, even if it's not him, is far-fetched. Yamato's death is also incompatible with the neutral route because in the neutral route, he fights you at the same location for the same reason, to use the tower to increase his power. Unless he was like holding back or something in the neutral route, which would be extremely out of character seeing how he uses the same rhetoric in both routes of calling your party a cancer that's dragging you down, there should be no reason the tower would collapse in one ending and not the other. It probably would have been easier and made more sense if Yamato was more consistent and tried to take you or Ronaldo out as Ronaldo pulls out his Chekhov's gun from the Makoto fight and shoots him. This would mean that in Ronaldo's route, Yamato wouldn't get any form of redemption and would look comically evil, but the alternative is either having Yamato be inconsistent between routes, or preferably if the neutral route just had a different battle for Yamato. The neutral route already has no unique battles, so this would have been welcome, but to me, this seems like an obvious example of the game not having enough time, so they had to do what they could, even if it made the writing worse. As for how this ending is framed as one of the worst, the only way we can see this within the ending itself is in the ending narration saying humanity won't prosper without competition for some reason. Otherwise, we're going to need to look at the other endings and how the game can put blinders on for the issues with the good ending. Yamato's ending will, much like Ronaldo's, follow the ideology I laid out when talking about meritocracy. Unlike with the last ending, I want to focus less on how the game tries to convince you the ending is bad, and more on Yamato Hotsuin himself. This isn't to say the game doesn't pull similar tactics to how they portrayed the egalitarian route, but I think it's more interesting to focus on how the ending relates to the person who advocates for it most. In case it wasn't already obvious, Yamato is an emotionally unstable person. He lacks empathy for others, is extremely possessive of the protagonist, and has a complex about his position of power. I don't say any of this to try to convince you that he's a bad person because I don't think that's true. I think he's a victim of circumstance, which may seem like a strange label to give someone in such a high position of power, but considering how much of a burden protecting Japan is and how isolated he is, I think it applies. Yamato, more than any other character in this game, is a tragic person. The game tries to play off Yamato not understanding civilian culture as a joke, but when you think about it, it's kind of fucked up. He's a 17-year-old who never asked to be raised as a prodigy lacking connections. He never asked for the weight of the world to be placed on his shoulders, and given his upbringing, it's only natural that he became someone who can't see past his own narrow vision of the world. Yamato suffers heavily from confirmation bias, as we can see with his interactions with the common masses. He's blind to what his upbringing did to and for him. I already touched on the way his extremely sheltered upbringing and isolation from society is bad for him, but I also want to point out how he has blinders on for how hard it is for people to get ahead in the face of social barriers. Yamato treats people like Fumi, someone who had very little but was still able to pull herself up by her bootstraps into a good position, as the standard, and that hard work and determination is all you need to get ahead when he himself is the beneficiary of specialized training. He clearly thinks he's better than everyone except for you, referring to people in his own organization as pawns and people outside as worthless, but he's only able to be so powerful because he had the tools to get ahead. Despite claiming to be against nepotism and family ties, it was his family ties that put him into the position he's in. This isn't to say that he didn't work hard, but that his hard work is secondary to the education he received. Again, I don't say this because I hate him, because I don't. I pity him. This upbringing clearly wasn't good for him, and I think it's very telling that when you fight him in other routes, you fight him alone. While the other route leaders always have their best friend at their side, provided that they're alive, Yamato fights alone, and Ronaldo likely isn't far off when he says Yamato sees his own men as disposable pawns. I didn't touch on it much when talking about the egalitarian ending, but when you beat Yamato, part of the reason you fail to recruit him is because you tell him something he never wanted to hear, that people, including him, are weak. Yamato has always believed that people overall were weak, but that he was going to do what was necessary to better humanity. Being told that he was one of the weaklings that he looked down upon was like negating his entire existence, and telling him that everything he's done until now has been for nothing. In fact, it's worse than everything he's done being for nothing, because accepting Ronaldo's proposal comes with accepting a level of guilt for letting so many people die. I think Ronaldo wanted to offer him a way out, and during that battle, Joe points out that the weight of the world is clearly heavy on Yamato's shoulders, and that it might be better for him to let go of that burden, but because of his pride, this is something Yamato cannot do. The reason I brought all of this up is because this ending is giving Yamato exactly what he wants, but in the world he creates, he still won't be able to make connections outside of you. He's made a greater gap between himself and the people, so when they get to the top of the hierarchy, they can only really be seen as enemies there to dethrone him. This isn't a world that can help someone who's emotionally volatile and lonely. This world would only reinforce his opinions that the masses are ignorant and would rather fight amongst themselves instead of progress, isolating him further from society. An individualist might argue that the protagonist can open him up and be more sociable, but that's an unstable solution at best. If the protagonist ever dies, then so does Yamato's only connection to empathy. And this is presented as a cutthroat Darwinist world, so death is not out of the question. The neutral route does provide a path that's better for him, but it's also really bad for everyone else, but I'm getting ahead of myself. There's still another ending before getting to the neutrals, and there's one more thing I need to bring up for this ending. There are 3 things worth noting in the ending cutscene. One is a soldier getting promoted because he was more capable than his superior and hunting him in the streets like a madman. I think this is an unfair characterization of the world Yamato wants because, as I said earlier, Yamato isn't as a rule in favor of violence. The game tries to acknowledge this by showing someone getting petty revenge only to be stopped by a lady who's against senseless violence, but won't help the person who was being attacked and was in desperate need of food. This shows a level of callousness and cruelty towards the suffering, which is consistent with how Gyps operated during the game, and while this is definitely bad, it's not quite on the same level as hunting people in the streets like a psychopath. The last event has a child showing that age isn't everything, and it admirably organizes people to escape from the demons. Wait, what? There are still demons on the loose in this ending, and they're killing people in the streets? And people somehow think this ending is better than the egalitarian one? I didn't mention this when going over what Yamato wants the world to look like because even if this wasn't the case, the world being created would still be cruel, but just to add insult to injury, demons are not removed from the world, and wild demons that attack people on sight are still on the loose. The worst part is that this probably isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's certainly a lot easier to have demons kill off the weak than do it yourself, and it's justified in this world because after all, if they mattered, they wouldn't have died so easily. Unlike how I argued for the egalitarian ending being good, I don't think pointing out how the meritocratic world is bad actually is a very hot take, so let's move on to the next ending, which will set up points for the message the game is trying to sell. This is the ending of the Anguished One, or as I'll be referring to him from now on, Al-Saiduk. Saiduk goes by 3 names, and the name he uses or gets depends on how much you know about him. He introduces himself as the Anguished One because he anguishes over the fate of humanity, and how he blames himself for this predicament. But once you convince him to overthrow Polaris and create a new world, he gains more confidence and decides to give himself a new name. It's noteworthy that he gives himself a new name because the Anguished One was never his name to begin with. He was originally known as Alcor, which was his designation as a Septentrion. His rejection of his old name in favor of a name to signify his new bond with humanity also doubles as a rejection of the name and role given to him by Polaris. This is a little on the nose, but I really like it because there's something really special about choosing your own name. The overwhelming majority of people aren't given the choice of choosing their first name. It's something that's either given to them at birth or determined by the community, but if you've ever decided to change your legal name or just have an online name you're really attached to and always go by, then you probably understand how empowering it can feel to decide something you never really had a choice on before. It's for this reason that I really like how Saiduk is annoyed with people who call him a weird or freaky guy because he has a name, and it's Saiduk. Unfortunately, Saiduk has to do a lot of the heavy lifting in this route, both because he starts out as your only ally at the beginning of the day, and because aside from the intrigue of spending time with this immortal godlike being, The route isn't great. The idea you come up with is to overthrow Polaris and create a new world from scratch, with no possible intervention from external forces. If you think the description of your proposal to Psyduke to create a new world is a little vague, that would be because it is. Psyduke tells you that if you go along with him and make a new world, this world will start over from the beginning, with no corruption or distortion. None of the damage humanity or Polaris has done to the Earth, and none of the accomplishments either. Because of how vaguely it's presented, it wouldn't be unreasonable to question what starting with a clean slate even means. In this new world, how much of humanity will be there? Unlike in the other endings where it's not a big deal that it's ambiguous whether or not everyone is brought back to life because it's not a stretch to think Polaris will undo the damage she caused, in this ending it's a very real concern with no good answer. Although it was never directly stated, bringing everyone who died because of the apocalypse back to life for the egalitarian and meritocratic routes would be the logical thing to do because those worlds would function better if 99% of Earth's population wasn't dead. But in Psyduke's ending, who's going to populate this new world? Just your party? The survivors and what's left of Japan? Everyone? These are important questions that weren't necessary to answer in the previous endings because even though it's not directly stated, and some might argue she doesn't given the reconstruction scene in Ronaldo's route or the demons on the loose in Yamato's, there's no reason to keep everyone who died because of the apocalypse dead. In this world, however, if every single person was brought back, then not only would the same power structures be in place on a social level, but everyone who needs medical help will die due to a lack of medicine and other necessary supplies. As it turns out, most humans aren't built to live in this kind of world. If we're generous and only assume that the survivors of Japan are what end up in the new world, and that's the case in all endings, that still doesn't address the problem because people on life support are all likely to die. If there's a pandemic, what if that just kills everyone because we don't have the supplies to fight it, or make vaccines and it kills off what little of humanity exists, but believe it or not, that's not even the biggest problem. Even though I like this route on the grounds that it's the only one where you get to fully explore Psyduke's character, it has a lot of issues. I could talk about how the way you recruit everyone in this route is very repetitive and makes all the characters feel flat and uninteresting. I could talk about how only Daichi and Psyduke have any meaningful dialogue. I could talk about how Psyduke barely criticizes the neutrals, and his only real criticism of the egalitarians is saying something along the incredibly stupid lines of their ideology doesn't matter. If they would work with Polaris to achieve their goals, they must be stopped, to childishly make this conflict less nuanced. But none of these issues come close to being the biggest problem with this route. The disconnect between the mindset you'd need to advocate for a world like this, and the logic that you use to end up in it. The world Psyduke creates does have upsides, as it would fix all the damages humanity has caused to the world. And if you're an environmentalist and think we may have gone beyond the point of fixing things ourselves, I would completely understand picking this ending. But even ignoring the fact that Ronaldo and even Yamato's worlds would likely address some of these issues, there's a bigger problem. You don't approach getting rid of everything humanity has ever done, the good and the bad, thinking that starting the world over from nothing is better than letting humanity spiral out of control. You approach this ending with the mindset that humans are amazing and have so much potential that they can make an unparalleled paradise in the new world without any pesky god like Polaris interfering. There's some severe narrative whiplash when a character with such a high opinion of humanity and is optimistic about their capabilities and potential also wants to undo everything humanity has ever accomplished. I get there's a hope that even if they're forced to start from scratch, they can rebuild to even greater heights, but the characters don't seem to have a sense for how long that will take. The impression the characters give when advocating for the new world is one that takes all the positives of the old world for granted. Things like, I don't know, medicine, shelter, reliable food, electricity, etc. We can live without some of those things, but it is considerably harder to build a better society that reaches greater heights when you're busy trying to meet your basic biological needs. This world is not the worst case scenario and does have upsides, certainly more than a variation of the last ending, but the downsides of what it'd be like to live in this new world are almost never considered. You could make a compelling argument that this world would be a good one, but the argument being made by the protagonist and his allies is that things will be fine if humans can do their own thing unimpeded. Individually, Saiduk's optimistic beliefs about humanity and the belief that the world got worse because of humans and that they need to start over are both fine things to have in a story, but not together. If this ending leaned more into the idea that the only way to undo humanity's mistakes is to get rid of all the previous social structures and systemic problems that prevented progress, is to start over from scratch and hope that a humanity that's been humbled by a demonic apocalypse might not make the same mistakes, I would think it's a well-written ending. Instead, the ending we got simps humanity so hard that you come to the conclusion that you should undo everything humanity has ever done. If they didn't want to frame this ending in a way that means humanity needs to reflect on its mistakes, it probably would have been better if Saiduk combined with the neutral routes, given that all the neutral routes are awful, and replacing the non-existent philosophy of the neutrals with Saiduk's philosophy. It would be a lot more consistent, even if it's less interesting, but I just said neutral routes. Plural. So let's end this by talking about the truly abhorrent writing present in the last ending. Although it may not have seemed like it at times, I did try to be fair to all the endings, and while I do think some were better than others, I hope I was able to recognize their strengths and weaknesses while not giving undue credit to some and not enough to others. Unfortunately for the neutral endings, I cannot think of a single good thing to say because they are all terrible. As if to add a cherry on top of this shit sundae, the neutral route also has multiple paths, but I'm going to be charitable and pretend the path where you kill Polaris and doom humanity to extinction in a broken world incapable of being repaired doesn't exist. What I do want to talk about before getting into the depths of depravity that is the neutral route is Hinako, the woman who by all rights should be the neutral leader, but isn't. As I went over earlier, Hinako will say she wouldn't risk her life to save a stranger just to prove a point against the egalitarians, and I think that already says quite a lot about her, but I think I really need to hammer home how awful she is. She's the primary reason you end up fighting the neutral faction in the other routes, even the ones where you go to them with the intention of making peace, because she pushes for a third way a lot harder than the faction's actual leader, Daichi. She relies on a lot of strawman arguments against the egalitarians, and despite claiming to want to find a peaceful solution, when Shiva comes to her aid, she doesn't ask him to hold back or try to threaten you into leaving. She taunts you and says she hopes you're ready to get your asses kicked. Now, to be fair, it's not as if being in favor of peace and being willing to resort to violence when necessary is mutually exclusive. But there's already another faction whose primary goal is peace, and it's horribly cringy when they fight and both are insisting to the other that they shouldn't be fighting. At least in the neutral route, some of the egalitarians are deliberately leading you into an ambush and are the aggressors, but if you are said egalitarians, the neutrals are the ones who challenge you in the name of stopping you from fighting the meritocrats, despite also wanting to stop the meritocrats. I think what makes Hinako worse in this regard is that she's a pretty gung-ho person, so it's not unreasonable for her to try and use violence to bring you to heel, if violence wasn't the very thing she was criticizing you for. The one thing Hinako has going for her over the other neutrals is that she puts forth more than one argument against the other factions, even if it is a bad argument. Unlike the other neutrals who are fundamentally on board with Ronaldo's ends but disagree with his means, Hinako actually disagrees with his ends too. This is why I said she should have been the leader, especially since their actual leader, by his own admission, isn't really suited for leadership, and when you side with him, he immediately abdicates to you. Sadly, the neutrals' own characters aren't even the worst victims of poor characterization in this route. Something I've been avoiding mentioning for the majority of this video is the fate rank system, because I really don't like it. Especially since it can create problems as we saw earlier with Makoto and Ronaldo, but it's unavoidable to mention how horrible the fate rank system is used when you choose to side with a faction. After you beat a given faction, you can recruit the other characters, and whether or not they join you isn't based on if they would ever agree with the ideology you stand for, but if you were a good enough friend. This was pretty bad in every route, but at least every other route has some characters you could conceivably see joining other sides. With the neutral ending, it's worse than the others because in the other routes, there was always at least one character who would stay true to their ideals. You do try to recruit Yamato and Ronaldo in each other's routes, but both choose death over abandoning their ideals, which felt fitting for them, even if the execution wasn't necessarily great. Despite all Ronaldo and Yamato say about never abandoning their ideals, they can be recruited in the neutral route. Now, you may think it's pretty perverse to have two ideologically driven characters join a route that idolizes the status quo, but it's even worse than that when you consider their deaths in Psyduke's route. It's excusable for them to die in their rival's route and not the neutral route, given that they were more opposed to each other than the neutrals, but Ronaldo was just as opposed to Psyduke as he was to the neutrals, and in Psyduke's route, he chooses suicide by attacking a demigod, saying he could never sacrifice his ideals, which is awful given that he does that very thing for the neutrals. If you think that's bad, it's even worse for Yamato, who does have a justification for opposing Psyduke, but that actually makes him joining you in the neutral route worse because he's more ideologically consistent than any other character in the game. Unlike Ronaldo, who said he wouldn't mind Psyduke's route, Yamato framed his beliefs as unshakable and that he would rather die than give them up. It's no coincidence that this is the route where you can recruit the most amount of characters in the game, given that the game really wants you to see this ending as the best possible one. You could almost say it makes sense that the ways in which you recruit people boils down to ideology bad, friendship good, given how awful the mentality that brought this ending into existence is, as well as the beliefs that drive them. I've said the neutral route idolizes the status quo, and if you never sided with them, that might seem like a pretty weird claim since they don't seem to idolize or even believe in anything other than friends shouldn't fight. The game honestly pulls a pretty manipulative trick with how the neutrals are framed, because if you don't join them, they don't have a plan. The other factions are quick to criticize them as naive in that not having a plan for how to fix the world isn't acceptable with humanity so close to extinction. Whining about the means isn't helpful if you can't propose a better alternative. The thing is, as you probably guessed by the fact that you can side with them, they do have a plan for how to fix the world, but won't tell or come up with the plan until after they destroy the opposition. The neutrals' plan is to return the world to the way it was before the apocalypse. This is something that all of the other opposing factions come to agree on after you beat them, and this is bizarre because the world before the apocalypse wasn't exactly good. Both Ronaldo and Yamato point out that their ideologies are meant to be retroactive. They aren't just trying to find solutions to the immediate predicament of Polaris' purge, but problems with humanity in their eyes. This only makes the fact that they agreed to do this worse, especially since both vehemently oppose Psyduke's new world, even though in said new world, they could theoretically create their respective utopias where it would be impossible to do in the old world. One of the most painful scenes in the game is when you confront Ronaldo and he tries to convince you to join him, and your party believes he can't be reasoned with. Daichi tries to convince Joe not to follow Ronaldo's path, and this is how it pans out.
Hey Joe, do you agree with him?
Well, yeah. Daichi, have you ever considered the viewpoint of the week?
Huh? Well, of course, I mean, I'm kinda dumb.
Yeah, that's not what I meant. Serious stuff. Poverty, race, illness. If all those miserable people could gain happiness, it could only help society. That's why I don't think an egalitarian society is bad at all. Can you understand?
That's true, but things were getting better in the old society. Maybe not as fast. We've grown so much in the past century, the past decade. We have to get even better.
You're right. I hear what you're saying, and I agree. Unfortunately, there are people in this world who can't wait another 10 years.
And what do the oh-so-intelligent neutrals respond with?
No, Joe!
No, really. That's it. The best argument they can come up with against the genuine criticisms against the beliefs they haven't stated yet is say no. This can also be seen in the less interesting but still poignant conversation with Yamato. You tell them that they're using the wrong means and also tell them not to chase their ends. I have a sneaking suspicion that returning the world to the status quo wasn't stated as their initial goals, because it's a remarkably stupid idea, and if they don't present it to the other factions, they'll be criticized for their lack of beliefs rather than the stupidity of their ends. Since many people think that their triumphant ending is the best ending of the game, given that the game presents it as such, I should probably back up my claims that this is a really stupid idea, but doing so isn't exactly hard. I would challenge anyone to look at the real world and ask themselves if this is a good world that doesn't need to be improved. Chances are you won't find anyone who would believe something so obviously wrong. Now, on its own, this isn't compelling enough to dismiss it as an ending if the other routes truly were too extreme. But as I've gone over, these endings aren't even that extreme. The reason I've been saying Hinako specifically should have been the neutral representative is because she displays more leader-esque qualities and claims in the other routes that she has a dream that they want to pursue too, which means it probably would have been easy to just have someone as outspoken as her put forth the neutral's end goal. If the neutrals actually presented their ends during the final meeting before the 7th day, the others would have had a chance to criticize that goal. Some criticisms could have included that the world before had problems, and that the other route leaders wanted to at least address these problems, such as poverty, starvation, bigotry, war, corruption, nepotism to an extent, greed, and incompetence. Since the neutrals wait so long to present their plans for fixing the world, they don't get criticized for their beliefs, so they don't have to defend them. It's just accepted that the world before the apocalypse is a good thing to return to. The triumphant ending is presented as the unrivaled best ending by the game, and you're told to just believe humanity will be fine this time because, apparently, since Polaris admired you and your party's determination, she won't become disillusioned with humanity's failings ever again. Because you're not going to solve those failings, because Yamato is the only person in your group capable of any large-scale change, and that's only in Japan. The game does acknowledge that if you don't change, the apocalypse will happen again, but that doesn't mean much when you spend the majority of the route telling people who have criticisms of society that they're wrong. It looks past any concrete flaws in the world for a nice happy ending where an overwhelming amount of people on Earth are suffering, but at least for you and your friends, everything is pretty good. This is the message of the game. Ronaldo and Yamato are meant to be representatives of the radical left and radical right respectively, despite not really representing either. Ronaldo's beliefs are just good, but are also very tame, and while Yamato's ideals are bad, they're not nearly as extreme as the views of fascists or others on the far right. Devil Survivor 2 wants its players to come away thinking that the status quo is fine and that people who criticize it are crazy, that if we try for sweeping change, we'll make things worse, and when faced with a crisis, if we can make things the way they used to be, then that's the best case scenario. You could argue that the game doesn't advocate for this, and that the neutrals just want humanity to get better without any external interference, but in real life, there is no celestial god controlling things. There's just us humans, and if nothing else, the game doesn't want you to think that the people who are advocating for change are correct. You're expected to sympathize with the people who want things to be the way they used to be, with no plan or intention to actually make things better on anything but a personal scale. I'll be honest, while some parts of the story are unbelievably frustrating, I do like Devil Survivor 2. It has problems, and the message behind the true ending is terrible, but it also has charming characters, and as long as you're willing to be skeptical, it can make you ask questions about the world's problems and why people who want to make the world better can come to radically different conclusions. The reason characters fight isn't always because they hate each other, because more often than not, they don't. If you take the neutral ending at their word, the reason people fight is because they're stubborn and aren't willing to listen to others, but I think a more useful message to take away from this is the importance of perspective. Ronaldo and Yamato came to the conclusion that the old world had issues that they wanted to fix, but came to different solutions because they had different perspectives. It sounds simple when I phrase it like that, but it's why I sympathize with Yamato despite thinking Ronaldo's solution is much better. No one sets out to make the world a worse place, and despite how much shit I gave the neutral ending, I know the writers didn't want to tell a story that says people dying of starvation is okay as long as you don't fight your friends. It's important and necessary to recognize a story or person's intentions, but it's also important to consider what message a story promotes. Devil Survivor 2 probably didn't set out to tell a story that promotes the status quo as ideal and shuns social change, but that's the message the true ending ultimately promotes. Well, I'd like to thank you all for watching. I think with this video, I'm finally done talking about the Devil Survivor series and can move on to other projects. Unless, they announce a Devil Survivor 3, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. Well, I guess all that's left to do is to wrap this up with a generic outro. What? Nicaea? Why is the game still running? I did every ending, I did all the routes. There shouldn't be any more content. Oh. Oh no. No, 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 no.
No! God, please, no! 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 No!